First, a little bit of housekeeping. If you could please remember to fill out the CME link that's attached to the Zoom invitation. That helps us track attendance and also continue the audio-visual aspect and hopefully food at some point in the future. So it'd be much appreciated if you could go ahead and fill that out, even if you're not claiming CME credit. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Travis Johnson. Dr. Johnson is one of our chief residents here and a third-year resident in pediatrics. He's a graduate of University of Kentucky for both undergrad and medical school. Prior to that, he's served in several interesting healthcare-related roles. He was a nurse at a camp, and he's also served as a ultrasound model, which sounds exciting. I've never encountered that. So.
It was super exciting.
He's also a board game enthusiast, and today he's going to talk about some of the interesting aspects of board gaming and how they might be useful to us. So I will turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Thanks, Dr. Dodd. I'm going to share this. So thanks everyone for joining us today. As Dr. Dodd said, I am what is called a board game enthusiast, which just means I like to play games. So when I was starting to think about what Grand Rounds topic I wanted to talk about, obviously gaming came to mind, and I was interested to see if there was any literature out there about playing tabletop games and pediatrics. And I was fortunate enough to find enough literature to fill about an hour-ish worth of talk. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is the disclosure slide saying that I don't have anything to disclose. So some learning objectives for today. Hopefully after today's talk, you'll be able to define and identify what is classified as a tabletop game. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of gaming, and the biggest portion of it is going to hopefully to develop an understanding of how tabletop games can be used in primarily education, therapy, and for lifestyle modification. And then we're going to think about how we can, some future research opportunities about tabletop gaming use. So just jumping right into that, what is tabletop gaming? Well, the definition that I came up with, this isn't like, set in stone or anything, are games that are typically played on a table or a flat surface, which is shocking, I know. It includes things like board games, card games, tile games, role-playing games, war games, and dice games. This does not include video and computer games. That's the big takeaway point here is video and computer games are considered a different media of gaming. There is lots and lots of research about video games in children, but I wanted to focus solely on those tabletop aspects of it. So we're going to look over a brief history of tabletop games, just to kind of show you how long they've been around and kind of the scope of gaming today. So to answer that question, how long have board games been around? The answer is a long time. This is a game called Senet, and it's one of the earliest known games, and it's one of the earliest games that we actually know how to play. It was developed in Egypt, and the Egyptians like to write things down, so we sort of know the rules for this game. It's basically you're trying to get from one side of the board to the other. The historians believe that it was initially created just for fun, but it was later used for spiritual purposes. They used it to kind of teach people how to navigate the afterlife, and it became a big part of Egyptian society. 4 sets of this game were found in King Tut's tomb. This is a painting of Queen Nefertari playing the game by herself around 1300 BC to, again, kind of highlight the spiritual aspect of it. We don't have a set time for when we think this, when this game was for sure created, but we're estimating it's around 3100 BC. And to kind of put that in perspective, Egyptians developed writing around 3250 BC. So about 150 years after they developed the writing system, they began making games like this to play. This is Mancala, and we're not sure when this game first originated. The first known actual board was discovered in about the 4th century, but it's estimated this was played much, much earlier than that, as early as 3000 BC in Africa. And the reason it's hard for us to know exactly when it first came about is because this is also a Mancala board, and it's just holes in the ground with rocks. So you can imagine if this is a game that someone's playing, eventually it's going to go away. There's some argument and debate about, is this like the first board game? It's impossible for us to know, but interesting nonetheless. Another game that we play today is Backgammon. It was around 2600 BC. It was found in Mesopotamia. It was very popular, particularly among the Romans. They developed their own version of it. This is called the Game of Twelves. It's obviously a little different, but the same kind of concept of the backgammon game that we play today. Go was developed in the 4th century BC in China. It's super popular among people today, and it's considered one of the 4 essential arts of a cultured Chinese scholar, and Confucius mentioned it in one of his works as worthy pastime of a gentleman. And then there's chess. Everyone knows chess. Everyone plays chess. Chess, as we know it, with the rooks and the pawns and things like that, started to be developed around the 7th century, but its roots date back to earlier, like 3rd, 4th century in India, and a game called Chaturanga. In India, they developed this game called Chaturanga, and then it was spread to Persia and Arabia, eventually up to Spain, and then the rest of Europe, and that's where we get the chess that we know and play today. Playing cards were developed in about the 9th century in China. This is one of the earliest known depictions of a playing card. A funny looking guy. And obviously there's tons and tons of games out there that use playing cards. Primarily we think of like card games and casino type games. Interestingly, the first known casino was, it's called the Rodado, has a very interesting story and history behind it. If you're interested in that, I encourage you to look that up. But that was in Venice in 1638. So people have been, gambling and playing games like this long before a more modern society. This is a Monopoly. I didn't know until putting this presentation together that the first Monopoly board was round. This is kind of what sparked the gaming, board gaming industry in America and the world by and large. It has a very interesting story about his development. It goes in the weeds a little bit. I encourage you to read that if you've never heard that story before. But there are versions of Monopoly galore today. There are literally 1,000 versions of Monopoly, including Johnson Cityopoly, which you can find at your local Walmart. You can visit places like Founders Park and Cherokee National Forest. Jumping forward a little bit, there's Dungeons and Dragons. So this is like the role-playing game. It was developed in 1974 by the guy named Greg Gygax. And these are games where you make your character, you give them a backstory, and then you go on an adventure with your party. It's less moving pieces on the table and more talking about what you're doing. And we're going to talk about a little bit about some more modern games. So Settlers of Catan is probably the most well-known of modern games. It was developed in Germany. Germany is a big place for board games. In 1995, and it was one of the first big games to make a splash in America. You can go up to someone and say, "Have you played Catan?" And they probably know what you're talking about. And then there's a whole smattering of others. There's Magic the Gathering, there's Ticket to Ride, there's games like Pandemic, which you can find all of these games in stores like Walmart, Target. You don't have to go to a specialty shop to find any of these. So we developed gaming almost as soon as we developed writing, and we've continued to make new games and play new games ever since. To kind of give you an idea of the scope of gaming today, the estimated global market for the tabletop industry is expected to be over $12 billion by 2023. There is a crowdfunding site called Kickstarter, if you're familiar with that, that has different categories. And the most funded gaming project, including video games and board games, was a board game called Frosthaven. It had over 83,000 backers and raised almost $13 million. As a side note, This Magic the Gathering card is autographed. It's one of the rarest cards out there. This is a screenshot from an eBay listing for the card on January of this year, and this card by itself sold for $511,000. So if you have one of those, you can put it on eBay. Board Game Geek is a online database that a lot of board game enthusiasts go to like catalog games and have forums and stuff. On that website, there's over 124,000 unique entries. And then just think of all the games that you've played, right? You've most of us have played Monopoly or Solitaire or Rook or chess or Catan or something with our parents or our kids or our friends, family, things like that. So I think we can safely assume that gaming, by and large, has always been a part of more modern society, and then we're continuing to do it. So as such, I think it would benefit us to think of, well, can we use it? Are there benefits to this? More generally, yes, there's benefits to play. We all know this. Children need to play. It's been well documented that when children play, they have improved outcomes in a variety of domains, including cognitive development, dexterity, their creativity, imagination, and their social interactions. The AAP has released a couple policy statements on this. The more recent one was the Power of Play, that talks about how how play is important for kids and how us as pediatricians can support them. When you combine that with other AEP policy statements, such as screen time recommendations, where we recommend less than 2 hours of sedentary screen time per day for older kids, let alone young kids, I think we can begin to see where potentially these tabletop games can come into play as some activities we can do with kids to enhance their development while keeping them away from screens. So we're going to jump in. We're going to look at three main domains today. We're first going to look at education, then we're going to look at therapy, and then we're going to look at lifestyle modification. And in each of these, we're going to look at a couple studies to see if tabletop games are being used for these things, and if so, are they effective for those? I'm going to preface this with, there's not a whole lot of literature here. There's very few randomized control trials. There's like zero meta-analyses or anything. It's predominantly education and psychology literature, but there is some things that I think we can at least gather some insights from. So for education specifically, we're going to look at two questions. First, is there a benefit from using games for education? And then two, kind of, are people doing it? So first, is there a benefit? We're going to look at this study. It's called the Mixed Method Research Study on the Effectiveness of Board Game-Based Cognitive Training Program. That's a mouthful. The Board Game-Based Cognitive Training Program is a program that the researchers developed that was based on what they termed cognitive games, and we'll look at a list of what games they considered those in a second. And their aim was simple. They wanted to enhance cognitive development. This is a quote from the article. How does board game-based cognitive training program influence the cognitive development, including linguistic, spatial, reasoning, discrimination, numerical, and general skills of children in primary school? And then they had several sub questions about that, but we're not going to focus on those right now. So what did they do? They looked at second and third graders in Turkey. It was a study done in Turkey. They screened 400 school children and had 120 participants, 60 second graders and 60 third graders. They filled out a general information form, the parents did, that looked at the child's gender, if they had siblings, did they do preschool, what's parents' education status, what does parent do for a living, what's their economic situation, and have they had any prior experience with games similar to the ones they were playing. Then they used this Thornstone Primary Mental Ability Test, which is a test that screens for and measures all those domains we were looking at before, like the linguistic, spatial, reasoning, all those things, with 181 questions. And then they played games. They played 2 days per week for an hour per day for a total of 12 weeks. So I had 24 total hours of the training or the game playing. The second graders played this list of games. So things like Rory Stories Cube, Qubits, Chocolate Fix. I've not heard of most of these, but I have heard of some of them. And then third graders played games like Last Letter, Architecto, Corridor, Reversi. If you're interested, you can Google these things and they all come up. I just never played any of them before. So they did their 24 hours of gaming, and what did they find? Well, first, they found that the teachers by and large loved it. These are just some of the quotes. There were a lot more in the article. Like one I can highlight is the last one. I do a big puzzle with my students in the classroom. My students who had difficulty in finding suitable pieces before the training now easily find the necessary pieces by paying attention to similarities and differences. So lots of the teachers thought that the program was very effective in improving some of the outcomes for their students. That being said, the teachers were also the ones playing the games with the students. So you could argue there might be a little bit of bias there. So is there more concrete data we can look at that says, yes, this was actually effective? And fortunately, there is. So remember, they did this questionnaire, and at the beginning, they found that the pretest, there was no difference between the two groups. So the kids who didn't play games and the kids who did play games started out on equal grounds. On the control group, their post-test scores weren't different than their pre-test scores. So they scored the same at the beginning and the end. The experimental group, so the group that went through the training program, did have significantly different scores. They were improved at the end. And the post-test found that for that experimental group, they were significantly higher than the control in all domains. So if we look, there's so many charts in this article, but this is just one of them. So if we look at this, we're looking at the post-test scores for the second graders in experimental and control groups. And on the left side, you see the 6 domains that they were testing. And if you look for linguistic skills, for example, the experimental group on the post-test scored 30.43, whereas the control scored a 26.27 with a p-value of 0, is what they say. So it would seem that based off this study, that when you play these cognitive-based games in a controlled setting, that there is improvement in the classroom setting. So with that basis, let's look at a specific example of another study that played one game. And there's not a name for this game. The article's learning from number board games, you learn what you encode. And it focuses on what they call the cognitive alignment framework, which this little subsection here is how they worded it in the article. It's a little confusing, but essentially what they're trying to say is if you make a game that resembles what you want children to learn, they're going to learn that thing better. So to test this out, they did 2 experiments. The first experiment, they looked at the effect of the type of accounting procedure that the kids used during the gameplay. And then the second one, they looked to see if it was actually the game that was effective or if it was the way that they counted. So for experiment 1, they looked at 42 kindergartners, and then they randomized them to one of 2 groups, either a count on group or a count from 1. Count on meant when they were on their board, whatever number they started on, they would count up from that number. So if they were on 45, they would count 46, 47, 48. Whereas the count from 1 group, they would count 1, 2, 3, no matter where they are on the board. They did a pre-test assessment, a post-test assessment, and then had 8 gaming sessions in between. And they looked at these domains that are listed here, and we'll talk more about those when we talk about the results. This is the board that they used. So it's a 10 by 10 grid and with a linear arrangement of numbers. There's been other studies that have shown when you arrange numbers this way that kids tend to learn them better when you put 11 on top of a 1 and 21 on top of 11. They also darkened the shade of blue every 2 rows, the thought being that it would reinforce the magnitude of the number. A kid would know that the dark blue at the top is bigger than the light blue at the bottom. So 98 would be bigger than 18. And they started at 0 and then spun on a spinner that was numbered 1 through 5 and then moved their piece until they got to the end. In each group of 10s, the experimenter would draw attention to a number they were on. So if they were on 46, the experimenter would say something like, hey, look, you're on 46 right now, just to kind of reinforce that, they were moving up the board. So what did they find? They found that for number line estimation, which is where they were read a number and then asked to mark its position on the number line, that the groups didn't differ on the pretest, but there was significant improvement in the count on group on the post test. So the count on group was able to better say this number goes here on the number line. Similarly, for number identification, which is where they were just shown a number and asked to name it, the count on group did better. when they tested counting on, where they would start with a number and then asked to count up like 3. So if they started on 36 and they were asked to count up 3, they would have to say 37, 38, 39. The count from one group showed no improvement, but the count on group did. And then for the last 2, they had these blank 10 by 10 grids. And for numerical encoding, they were shown a number and asked to point to on the screen where they thought that number would be. And then for the reproduction, they were asked just to draw the board. And for both of those things, the count on group did better. This is just some graphical representations of those things. So A is number line error. The count on group had a larger decrease in error than the count from one group did. And similarly, in all those other domains we talked about, the count on group did better. What the next question they asked, and the reason they did the second experiment was, is it actually the game that's helping them do this, or is it that the children who are on doing the count on method are actually saying those numbers, right? So the count from one group, they weren't saying, 50, 51, 52. They were just saying 1, 2, 3. So is it the counting with the actual numbers or the game itself that led to this improvement? So for the second experiment, they got a third cohort of kindergartners, 21, and they played the game the same as the count from one group. So they counted 1, 2, 3 whenever they moved. But at the end of it, they included a counting activity. So they named all Arabic numerals between 0 and 100 in order using count on technique. And they looked at varying sequences. So they divided it into like 34 sequences, and then they were between 1 and 5 numbers long. So, they would have to replicate the length of counting on that the count on group did. And what they found was that there were improvements in some of the domains for these kids. So they did better than the count from one group did, but they didn't do as well as the count on group did. And kind of from that, they concluded that it was the game aspect itself that led to the largest improvement. There are several other papers out there that have similar types of studies with similar results. I'm not going to talk about all of them, obviously, but I think we can at least appreciate that from these couple studies we looked at, that there could be some benefit for using games in the education setting. Now we're going to talk about therapy. So again, there's 2 questions I asked when I was looking this up. First, are tabletop games actually used in therapy today? And if so, is there a benefit to it? So this first paper, this is not like a research study. This was done by a psychologist named Jill Bellinsen, who happens to use games in her practice of. What she talks about is how she does it, essentially. She discusses that the games address several developmental tasks that we try to teach kids. We try to teach kids how to sit still and wait your turn, and playing board games kind of reinforces those ideas. And she posits that these the use of games like this could be useful after the dramatic play stage. So this is younger kids who like to make believe and pretend, and before the stage of engaging in talk therapy, which is she says is more like mid to late adolescence. So really looking at those kids in late childhood and early adolescence. She has several boxes, box 2, box 3, and box 4 in her paper, and then she kind of explains what she means by those boxes. So box 2 is that the therapy session begins with the kid picking the game. So she'll offer them toys to play with, or games or puzzles, and she'll just see what they choose. And if they pick a game, then she asks herself, well, why did they choose this game? Is this game appropriate for their age level, right? Is this a 12-year-old who's picking a game that you would expect like a 5 or 6-year-old to pick? And if they're doing that, well, why are they doing that? Are they, picking the same game over and over and over again? Is it a game that they know they're going to be able to win because there's not a whole lot of skill involved, so they're going to choose that game because they like to win? And then from there, after she did this, she noticed that a lot of the time kids would change the rules. So when the kid changes the rules, she wants to know, well, do they do it at the beginning? Like when you're explaining the rules of the game, does the kid say, well, I don't want to play this way, I want to play this other way? Or does something happen in the game that they don't like, and then they change it? Similarly, like when they change the rule, how do they do it? Are they open about it? Do they make it known like, hey, I'm going to do this? Or do they try to cheat, basically? Do they quit the game? Do they try to pick a different game? Do they have a tantrum? And by observing how the child deals with all this, it can kind of give the therapist insight to what the kid might be thinking in their thought process. Similarly, box 4 is the therapist's comments on the child's play, so that she wants them to observe the child playing and then interpret the child's awareness of things, the child's feelings, what circumstances are going on, and then the biggest thing is, how do they handle the outcome? If they win, how do they react? If they lose, how do they react? And there's a few other papers out there by psychologists who mention similar things and say that they do use games in their practice. Again, there's not like a large meta-analysis of if all of these things are effective, but there have been a few studies about specific games that therapists have used and if they have improvements for kids. So we're going to look at one of those games specifically, and it's a game called Shop Talk. This is a game that was designed based on some prior work of the authors to be used for therapy sessions in kids living with cancer. The premise of the game is there's a colorful board with 10 stores that we're going to look at a picture of in a second. And each store has 15 questions related to that store's theme. So for example, there's the unconditional love pet store. And in that pet store, it's going to explore the people and parts of life that those kids find that are accepting and supportive and helpful. And there's a range of questions in some of these stores. Some of them are super simple questions like, what is your favorite movie? But others are really tough questions for kids. Imagine if you were never diagnosed with cancer, how would your life be different right now? Or do you think if a child's disease could not be cured, that the child should be told? And if so, who do you think should tell the child, the doctor or the parent or someone else? So, this huge spectrum of softball questions and then kind of hard hitting ones. So the kids would roll the dice and move their little shopping bag around the board. And when they entered the store, they would get asked the question, and then they could either buy the store products where they answer the question and then receive a token, or they can say, I'm just looking, and they don't answer the question, they don't get a token. The first person to collect a token from all 10 stores wins the game. And here you can kind of see that, right? A bright, colorful board, you have your shopping bags, you're moving around it. Nice and happy. So they developed this game, and then they distributed 230 copies to major pediatric cancer centers and at this pediatric oncology social work conference. 4 months after they distributed the games, they sent out a survey to those who they gave the games to fill out, and 110 people responded. They tried to use open-ended questions. They asked things like, what did you find the most helpful? What did you find the least helpful? Were there any difficulties? Things like that. And then they took 2 independent coders who looked at all the responses and kind of grouped them into themes and ranked them essentially. So of the 110 people who responded, 62 said that they had used Shop Talk in their clinical practice, so about 56%. Of those 62, 79% had used it in individual therapy sessions, 26 in group therapy, and 28 in family therapy. And if you add all those numbers up, that's more than 100. But that just means that some people used it in multiple therapy settings. Similarly, about 74% used it for 9 to 12-year-olds, about 42% for adolescents, and about 42% for less than 9. Again, they just, some of them use them for different age groups. And I think there's 2 notable things from this study that they talk about. The first is that of the 62 people who responded or have used it, 96% of them plan to continue to use it. So of the people who had actually played the game, they felt that it was helpful, 96%. And then the second thing that I think is notable is how useful they found it. So they put this chart in. And if you're having trouble seeing, essentially the darker the color means the less useful they found it. And for all the categories they looked at, more than 50% of the respondents found the game at least somewhat useful in addressing those issues. And for the majority of them, it was at least pretty useful, right? So for adjustment and adaptation, almost 75% found it at least pretty useful or very useful. The worst outcome one, I guess, it was suicidal ideation, where up to 40% found it not useful at all, and only 20-ish% found it pretty useful or very useful. But again, by and large, of the 62 respondents, the majority of them felt it was useful in almost all of these domains. And then again, they have their anecdotal quotes. Like, the game is great for first sessions as introduction to therapy. I enjoy how the questions really draw for information that is useful in a pediatric oncology setting. Kids rated a 10. It's a useful tool to add to my toolkit. So this would seem to suggest that it was useful in these people's practice. But this is also from the perspective of the people, giving the therapy sessions. Like, these are the therapists or the social workers. This isn't from the kids themselves, and they didn't really talk about how the kids viewed the game in this particular paper. But there was another study that was done. So this was done in 2019. The original shop talk was made in English and in Spanish, and this study translated it into Italian and looked at Italian pediatric patients. And they wanted to see how acceptable and feasible it was from the patient's perspective, as well as its effect on the patient's affect. They defined acceptability as the comprehensibility, the relevance, and the engagement of the game, and feasibility as there being barriers to use and the overall usefulness. They played the game with 30 of their pediatric patients, and of those 30 patients, 93% found it acceptable and feasible. So 93% said that it was easy to understand, that it was relevant to them, that it was engaging, that it was useful, that it wasn't difficult to play. They did find that ages like 7 to 12 perceived it better than older kids. But again, if we think back to the paper we talked about earlier with the psychologist, she also noted that she had better success with board games in that age range rather than older kids. So based off this, obviously small sample size, the kids seem to enjoy it for the most part. And if you look at their affect before and after they played it, there was improvement. So the positive affect before they played was, on this scale that I've not heard of before, was 49.7, and after it was 59.3, which they found to be significantly improved. Similarly, they found that the negative affect decreased from 20.6 to 17.7. So there seems to be people using games for therapy, and there is some data that suggests that these games can be useful tools in therapy sessions. Obviously, these games aren't replacing therapies, right? They're not replacing the role of therapists, they're not replacing other modalities that therapists use, just going to be an additional tool in their toolkit to use. There's been other studies done about the utility of games in areas such as parents' perceptions on kids' emotions, using games for family therapy sessions, and then addressing traumas, specifically sexual abuse. And all of them have had similar results, right? It's not like super like slam dunk evidence, we have to do this for all kids, but there seems to be suggestions that games could be useful in the majority of these sessions. The last kind of domain we're going to look at is lifestyle modification. So can we use tabletop games as a means of lifestyle modification? Can we use games to have better health outcomes for our youth? And when I was thinking about looking for a study to look at for this, the question came up, well, what's one health issue that affects children of Northeast Tennessee, and can I find something that relates to that? The answer that came almost immediately to mind was obesity. So let's look. The game Kaleido is a board game that was developed in Italy. The Italians love to play games too, apparently. This was a 2015 study, and the game represents a journey through the daily meals of the Mediterranean diet. They did not have a picture of this. It sounds fascinating to me, though. It's a 2 to 4 player game with a board that has 60 spaces. And there's 100 cards. There's 80 nutrition cards, which represent the energy that you take in, and then 20 activity cards, which represents the energy that you burn. And the goal of the game is to balance your total energy intake with your total energy expenditure based off your basal metabolic rate. And the game comes with a table where the player can use their actual age and weight to find their personal BMR. And then they score points based off the balance of their energy balance, what food items they have, and if they have a variety of foods. Of all the things I looked at, this is probably one of the larger studies. So it had 3,110 participants. Around 1,600 or so were assigned to the treatment group, so played the game Kaleido, and around 1,400 were assigned to the control group, so didn't. They used a checklist called the Adolescent Foods Habit Checklist, and then six sections of what they call previously published dietary questionnaire, as well as looked at the BMI Z-score of all the participants. And these kids played the game once per week for 20 weeks. So played the game a total of 20 times. And then after that, were assessed at 6 months and 18 months. They did have, quite a large loss to follow up. So at 6 months, they only analyzed about 2,200 students. And at 18 months, it was down to almost 1,000. But they accounted for that a little bit in their statistical analysis. So results. First, were the groups similar at the start? And yes was the answer. They didn't differ on BMI, age, or what their questionnaire scores were. Two of the domains in that, of those subsections in that checklist they did were self-efficacy and barrier to change, and they found no difference in the groups at 6 months or 18 months. So there was no improvement for self-efficacy and barrier to change between the control and the experimental group. For the adolescent food habits checklist, and then the other 4 sections of that dietary questionnaire, they found that the groups were statistically different at 6 months, with the treatment group scoring higher. But at 18 months, the treatment group was not statistically different in any of the outcomes. So when I read that, I was, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little disheartened, because it would seem to indicate that there was no utility of playing this game at all, right? Yes, at 6 months, they had some increased knowledge as compared to the control group, but at 18 months, there was no difference based off of these scores. But there was one more measure that they looked at, right? They looked at BMI Z-score, and they had this graph. So the blue line represents the control group, and the red line represents the Kaleido group. And they found that at 6 and 18 months, there was a significant difference in the actual BMI of the kids who played the game. So at 6 months, Kaleido players' odds of increasing weight were 0.396 times that of the control group. So they were less likely to increase weight as compared to the control group. And at 18 months, it was 0.435 times. And then if you look at the pie charts on the right, at time 0, 35% of the participants were overweight and 14% were obese. But at 18 months, only 32% were overweight and 9% obese, with normal weight increasing up to 58%. Like I said, they did lose several people to follow up, and it's not like huge strides, but think of our obesity rate here in Northeast Tennessee, and if we could improve it even by 7% just by playing a game one time per week, I think that's pretty fascinating and relatively easy to do. There's other studies that have kind of commented on the use of games for weight management specifically, but there's also a lot of region-specific studies that have been done. For example, there's one study that shows that if you play a game designed to prevent parasitic infections, that children who play that game are less likely to develop those infections in Africa specifically. So it would seem that there, again, is potential benefit to playing games in terms of having better health outcomes for children. Okay, we have enough time, so we're going to do a bonus topic. Trainee education. Can games be used in training programs for those of us who are caring for children? I found 2 papers about this. The first is called Serious Games, a game changer in teaching neonatal resuscitation. And it looked at board games, video games, and virtual reality games. They looked at 4 board games, and then they specifically commented on 2 of them. The first is called Retain, and what they found was it led to a 10% increase in knowledge retention. And the second one was called the Neonatology game, and if you played that game, you had a 4.15 points higher test score compared to control, like in a pre-test, post-test situation. So, can playing board games increase your knowledge of neonatal resuscitation? For these 2 little studies, yes. Again, these aren't super duper great studies, but we're working with what we have. The more interesting one to me is Learning to Beat the Shot Clock, a low fidelity sim board game for peds and EM residents. The point that they made in this study was that because you're not doing a high fidelity simulation, right? You're not in the sim lab. It's not that high pressure situation. You can focus more on the decision making aspects rather than the mechanics of doing the things, right? You don't have to worry about actually saying I'm putting an IV in now, I'm intubating the child, things like that. You can go through and take your time and think about it. So they designed this game that was based on 2 case simulations, and the participants took a pre-test, played the game, and then did a post-test. Again, it was a very small cohort. They looked at 23 PEDS residents and 9 EM residents. What they found was that on the pre-test, there was 71% correct, and on the post-test, there was an 83% correct, which they, based off their statistical analysis, found to be significant improvement as compared to a control group. So if I could play a game to be better at NRP or PALS or shock or seizure management, or the list goes on and on and on and on, I would do that in a heartbeat. So, conclusion. We looked at, this is just a quick overview about some of the literature that's out there. And I think an argument can be made that there is some utility to at least pursuing this further. I think there's been evidence that's shown that games seem to benefit kids when we have specific outcomes for those games in mind. Right? This isn't looking at, if I just play a game with my kid every single day, are they going to be a better student? This isn't what the literature talks about. It talks about if we have a certain goal in mind for the games, can we achieve those goals? And by and large, the things I looked at said, yeah, we probably can. So where do we go from here? Well, there's a few things we can do. First, we can try to establish standards for age ranges of games. So if you go to a Walmart or Target and you pick up a game, it's going to say this game is for like 13 plus or for 6 plus. And in my research, I found there's not really like a standardized way for them to do that. It's more of, do they want it to be classified as a toy or not a toy? Because if they want it to be not a toy, they have to put an older age on the box. And if they want it to be classified as a toy, the developers of the game just kind of make it up. I would love to see more studies about more modern or mainstream games. Most of the things we talked about today, they designed the game for the study, right? They had that purpose in mind. They didn't play Settlers or Ticket to Ride or anything like that. When you have tons and tons of games, picture's loading. So this is my board game shelf. When you have all these games, when I was going through doing the preparing the talk, I would look at this shelf and say, well, I see so much potential for things I can look at. I have a game based off the periodic table. If I play that game with my kids, are they going to learn the periodic table better? I have games where we have to work together. Is that going to improve, communication skills and things like that? I would love to see using studies looking at games like this, games that people are going to play in their home every day with their kids, rather than designing one specific for the study you're looking at. I mentioned this sort of just a second ago. I'm looking at different types of games. The 2 I've pointed out are co-op games, so games where you're working together as a team to achieve a common goal, and then social deduction games. I think these 2 would be interesting because there's a lot of communication that goes on. There's a lot of social interaction. There's a lot of leadership style roles. So can we use those games for those things? Can we use those games to improve social interactions among kids? Can we use those games to help develop leadership skills in our youth? looking how games can influence ethics or morality, specifically deception and lying, and then role-playing games. So in lots of games you play, you have to lie. In a social deduction game where you're trying to keep your identity secret or something, you might lie about who you are. Does lying in games like that correlate to lying outside of games? Similarly with role-playing games, you're commonly presented with moral dilemmas, and how does your character in the game react to those dilemmas? Is that indicative of how you would react in real life? Can we craft dilemmas and outcomes of the game to shape how you would react in real life? And then trainee education. Again, designing games to reinforce learning points. That would be fantastic. Bonus topic, second edition. There actually has been at least one study out there that has looked at morality and role-playing games. This is by far the weakest study that I looked at. It only looked at 12 college students. So, older adolescents, we'll say. And they divided into two groups of 6, and then they played 6 4-hour sessions of Dungeons and Dragons with embedded moral dilemmas. And there were things like, do we delay completing the job we did in order to help this plague-stricken village? Do we torture the prisoner to save lives later on? How do we treat creatures with lower intelligence than us? Is native inhabitants a sufficient claim to land ownership? And what they found was that the role-play gaming group experienced a degree of moral growth that was not displayed to the non-gaming group that they studied. And they specifically noted that at the heart of it, it was the gaming group's display of less interest in low-level moral reasoning, which they termed personal interest and values. So they saw a greater growth in camaraderie and group efforts in the gaming group as opposed to the non-gaming group. And I think you can easily translate some of these things to real-life situations, right? How do we treat creatures with lower intelligence than us? How do we as physicians, as residents, as attendings, treat learners, right? Do we treat them as inferiors or do we treat them as equals? And then on a larger scale, as society, like, is native inhabitants a sufficient claim for land ownership? There's, been lots of discussions in the past few years about colonialism and, how do we handle that as individuals and a society? So I think it could be easy to translate some of these moral dilemmas that we can put into role-playing games into real-world situations, real-life scenarios, and to kind of help us grow in that way. Similarly, I said before, there's not really studies out there about gaming in a natural environment. Right? All of these studies have been, we're going to design this game or we're going to test this group of children and see what happens. There was an article that came out called The State of Play that was a co-op effort. Boston Children's and Harvard Medical School teamed up and made this Center on Media and Child Health that was sponsored by Hasbro. And in 2015 published a literature review that showed what the recent experimental research on play was. It wasn't just board game specific, but play specifically. But what they found was there wasn't a single study that was longitudinal and captured children playing in their natural environments. More Play Today is a kind of ongoing study that looks to address this. So they enrolled 327 children between 2.5 and 8-year-olds in the United States and in Mexico. And the final results aren't published, but they have put out kind of an interim paper with some preliminary data. And they have a bullet point specifically about board and card games. And what they found was that board and card games are associated with school readiness in children in both U.S. and Mexico. So kids who played games at home are more likely to be better prepared for school. In the U.S., if they played games at home, they tended to have a larger vocabulary. And in Mexico, if they played games at home, they were found to be less aggressive, have less sadness, had fewer attention problems, and had more positive social behaviors. I'm super excited that this particular study and research like this is kind of ongoing and kind of starting to address some of the things that I want to see. I'm very much looking forward to the final results of the study, and I'm hoping that when this comes out, that it will inspire others to begin doing more research into the possible benefits of tabletop gaming, specifically for kids and us pediatricians. So, any questions?
Hi, Travis. I thought that was an awesome presentation. So thank you for, I think that's a topic that I could say I've never been exposed to and definitely interesting. I just had a question about the RPG study. And you may not remember, but I was just wondering for the control group with that, did they like discuss moral issues and then contrast that with the subjects who were playing the game?
They did. They said that,
Okay.
if I'm recalling correctly, that they the control group had like a moral development, not a class, but like a little like moral development training. And they did comment that there were some aspects that they measured that they actually had surprising. The control group did better in some aspects, but that one that I talked about was the one that they noted improvement more than they expected in the role playing group.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so I guess there's something experiential about the game that really may drive points home or let people consider things.
Yeah.
Hey, Travis, I wanted to say I really enjoyed the talk and thank you. And I had a quick question, and maybe in some ways this is a philosophical question, but did in your review of the literature and stuff, did you find any sort of theme in sort of funding for research studies into gaming? I think like many things in pediatrics and child development, this sort of strikes me as a domain that is potentially kind of underfunded and underinvestigated because of that. Who tends to fund studies for stuff like this?
That's a great question that I don't have a great answer to. Like I said, the More Play Today study is being funded by Hasbro, which obviously is a large toy manufacturer who makes a lot of these games. But I didn't specifically see like who is funding these other studies, or if there's ongoing research, who's funding that.
Gotcha. Do you see, is there any idea of who might fund stuff? I guess manufacturers, but
I think manufacturers are probably going to be the biggest bang for your buck, if you will. Dr. Swift in the chat asked if I came across any research regarding socioeconomic status in playing games. No, I actually try to find some data about like how many people play games in America, how many households play games, how many games do households have, how often they play games, stuff like that. And granted, there were a couple that asked me to pay money to look at them, and I didn't do that. There wasn't like great published data about who plays games every day, or like what families own games, things like that, which is surprising to me. It feels like a toy manufacturer, someone would want those numbers. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks guys again for listening to me.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation, Travis. That was awesome.
All right. Hope you all have a good day.